It's my pleasure, therefore, to present to the chairman of the day, the past president and judge of the Superior Court of the state of California, in and for the county of Sacramento, Brian Van Camp. Brian?
Thank you, President Phil. Fellow Rotarians, our speaker today, fellow Rotarian Bill Shubb, is the Chief Judge of the United States District Court for the Eastern District of California. President Phil, with some of the equipment has fallen apart since I did this on a weekly basis. I don't know what I'm doing, but that's not new either. I will. Bill Shubb, our fellow Rotarian, was appointed by President George Bush Pare in 1990 to the federal bench. Bill grew up in the city of Oakland and went up Telegraph Avenue and enrolled in the University of California at Berkeley. He took his bachelor's degree in 1960 in sociology and his law degree from Cal's Law School, Bolt Hall, in 63. Bill's academic achievements and winning ways earned him a clerkship with then federal judge Cheryl Halbert. He stayed in Sacramento and in the federal practice after his clerkship by serving in the U.S. Attorney's Office for 9 years, eventually rising to the position of Chief Assistant U.S. Attorney. Bill entered private practice in 1974 when he joined the law firm of Diepenbrock, Wolf, Plant, and Hannigan, where I was pleased to have been his partner. He practiced there until his appointment to the bench some 15 years later, but took time out in the early 80s to serve as U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District of California. Bill is married to his wife, Sandy, and is the proud father of 3 daughters, and he and Sandy enjoy their 3 grandchildren. He joined our Rotary Club in 1994 and has been an active member, hosting several memorable brown bag meetings, and will do so again soon, and is currently chairing our bylaws committee, a thankless task if there ever was one in this club. Bill has recently taken on the presidency of the newly formed Historical Society for the U.S. District Court of the Eastern District of California. He will speak to us today as one of President Phil's sesquicentennial speakers. His topic is Frontier Justice. This tale begins in 1855 in the chambers of the California Supreme Court, which then sat not 12 blocks west of where we sit today. His tale ends 35 years later in the halls of the United States Supreme Court. Please give a warm Rotary welcome to our fellow Rotarian, Chief Judge Bill Shubb.
One of my favorite old radio shows used to begin with the announcer saying, "The story you're about to hear is true. Only the names have been changed to protect the innocent." Well, I always wondered about that, but I can tell you that the story you are about to hear this afternoon is absolutely true. And the names have not been changed because there are no innocent. We're talking about California in the 1850s. Our story begins, as past President Brian has told you, at the B.F. Hastings building on 2nd Street between J and K in Old Sacramento. Many of you may have walked right past it and not noticed it. But in the 1850s, that building was home to the California Supreme Court. 3 judges sat on the court at that time. Our story is about 2 of those judges and how the paths of their lives came together in order to shape California history. The chief judge of the court at that time is a man named David S. Terry. Born in Todd County, Kentucky, he was the son of a slave-holding cotton planter. He was raised in the Texas frontier, where fights and brawling, duels, assaults with a deadly weapon were all a matter of daily occurrences. In 1846, he joins the Texas Rangers to fight the war against Mexico. In 1849, he joins up with a group of the Rangers in an expedition to California. They take the overland route and ultimately settle in what is now Stockton, California. Terry takes up the practice of law in Stockton and soon becomes well known as a conspicuous and outspoken member of a social and political set known as the Southern Chivalry Democrats, or sometimes called the Cavaliers. They are pro-slavery and hostile to foreigners, which seems to include anybody who is not an American of English Protestant descent. In 1855, Terry runs for and is elected to the California Supreme Court on the Know Nothing Party ticket. Now picture him, a large man, 6'3" to 6'6", powerful physique, thick whiskers, and at his side, even under the coat of his tailored suits or his judicial robes, he always carries a big, sharp Bowie knife. That's going to fit prominently into our story. The second judge on the court at that time is Stephen J. Field. He is the political and the physical opposite of Terry. He's born in Haddon, Connecticut, raised in Massachusetts. His father was a Congregationalist minister. He was valedictorian of his class at Williams College. When he hears the news of gold in California, Field comes across the Isthmus of Panama to San Francisco and then takes the Sacramento River up to Marysville, where he begins the practice of law. Field's practice in Marysville was not without controversy, I must say. 5 times the Superior Court judge there attempted to either disbar him or hold him in contempt. And then when Field was later elected to the Assembly in 1850, he initiated proceedings to impeach that judge. When that failed, he managed to restructure the judge's district so that he no longer sat in Marysville. In 1857, Fields is elected to the California Supreme Court. He is a free soil, anti-slavery Democrat. Now picture him, slight in build, much smaller than Terry. He's an older man, bald with a long beard. His appearance and utterances have been likened to that of an Old Testament prophet. Now the third judge on the court happens to be Peter H. Burnett. You may remember him as the first governor of California. But not too many people remember that after he was no longer governor, he was appointed to the California Supreme Court in 1857 to fill a vacancy there. He does not fit prominently into our story. Lawlessness had reached epidemic proportions in California by this time. In 1856, vigilantes literally had taken over San Francisco. Now, I'm not talking about the ragtag kind of posse that you see in the Western movies. I'm talking about an organized body of some of the city's most prominent and respected citizens. They were just disenchanted with what they saw as the failure or the inability of the new government to deal with crime, corruption, and moral decay in the city, and they decided to take it in their own hands to do something about it. A band of more than 5,000 armed men had taken over a large building on Sacramento Street known as Fort Vigilante, Fort Vigilance, or sometimes Fort Gunny Bags, named after the gunny sacks filled with sand that they'd put around the structure. On May 22nd, 1856, things came to a head when the vigilantes publicly hanged Charles Cora and James P. Casey before a large body of spectators in front of Fort Gunny Bags. At this time, Judge Terry, Governor Neely Johnson, and Senator William Gwynn are all Southern Chivalry Democrats. They control the state government, but they do not represent the views of the majority of California's citizens at that time. Now, the Chivalry Democrats consider the vigilantes to be a menace. Publicly, it is because the vigilantes are anarchistic. But the real reason is that the vigilantes pose a threat to the Southerners' efforts to control politics in California, and ultimately, their goal is to turn it into a slavery state. So, Governor Johnson sends a subcommittee of Judge Terry's closest friends to San Francisco to suppress the insurrection. Apparently, the press of court business in Sacramento was not too great at that time, because Judge Terry seems to have appointed himself chief of the law enforcement officers and goes to San Francisco personally to get the situation under control. As it turns out, that is a mistake. The vigilantes send a detachment headed by one Sterling A. Hopkins to arrest one of the governor's agents, a man named Reuben Maloney. Maloney then flees to a temporary headquarters set up by the Anti-Vigilante Committee in a building on Washington and Kearny Streets. The Vigilante Patrol finds Maloney under the protection of a group of Southerners under the leadership of Judge Terry. Hopkins announces his intention to arrest Maloney. Terry draws his trusted Bowie knife. Not wanting to engage in battle with a judge of the California Supreme Court, Hopkins wisely retreats. However, on orders from Vigilance headquarters, Hopkins then returns to, quote, keep Maloney under watch. The Southerners then, led by Terry, take Maloney to a nearby armory. Hopkins, not so wisely, tries to arrest Maloney. Terry threatens Hopkins with a shotgun, which he's found in the armory. There's some pushing and there's some shoving. One of the Southerners fires a pistol, we don't know who, and then Hopkins jostles Terry. Then Terry, quote, in a towering rage, pulls out his Bowie knife and stabs Hopkins in the neck. When the vigilantes learn what has happened, troops from all parts of the city pour in, and the Council of War resolves to take the armory by storm. Led by their chief marshal, mounted on a white charger, the vigilantes march into the armory and take Terry into custody. Judge Terry is then taken to Fort Gunnybags, where he is held pending trial. Now, if Hopkins had died, there is no doubt at all, that Terry would have been executed. So while the state waits anxiously for several days, Hopkins remains in critical condition. Meanwhile, Terry's friends enlist the assistance of the United States Navy. The USS John Adams is positioned off the coast of San Francisco. Its commander, with a great name, E.B. Boatwell, also a Southern chivalry Democrat, writes a letter to the Vigilance Committee in which he threatens to use, quote, all the power at my command to save the life of a native-born American citizen whose only offense is believed to be in his efforts to carry out the law. Now, Terry is obviously concerned. The usually brazen Terry offers to resign his position on the court if Hopkins dies. And he says, if acquitted, I will at once leave the state should you desire. As it was, Hopkins made an amazing recovery. Terry then withdraws his offer to resign and to leave the state. Terry is then tried by the vigilantes, and after 25 days of hearings, he is found guilty. Guilty of resisting vigilance officers and guilty of assaulting Hopkins. Over the objection of many of the rank and file vigilantes, the committee orders Terry discharged from their custody. Terry then quietly returns home to Sacramento in the company of his wife and Senator David Broderick aboard the USS John Adams. It's not until later that we learn that if Terry had been sentenced to hanging, United States Judge Matthew McAllister had agreed to issue a writ of habeas corpus. And the admiral at Mare Island had agreed to send 2 other Navy ships to support the John Adams in enforcing the judge's order, if that should become necessary. Now, if those ships had been called upon to fire their cannons on Fort Gunnybags, I think we can assume it would hardly have been a surgical strike. And one can only imagine how much of the rest of the city of San Francisco would have been wiped out if that had occurred. One can also only imagine what kind of reception Judge Terry got from his colleague Judge Field when he returned home to the court in Sacramento. Now, I haven't forgotten about Judge Field. In 1863, Congress creates a 10th seat on the United States Supreme Court and orders that it be filled by a judge appointed from the Pacific Coast. Field's good friend Leland Stanford and his brother David Dudley Field prevail upon President Abraham Lincoln to appoint Field to the position. And so Field is appointed to the United States Supreme Court in 1863. At that time, justices of the Supreme Court sat not only in Washington, but also rode the circuit for part of the year. In the meanwhile, Terry also leaves the California Supreme Court, but not for the same reason. He leaves to engage in the most celebrated and controversial duel in the history of California, which could be the subject of a whole other speech, which resulted in his shooting and killing Senator David Broderick, the man who rode from San Francisco to Sacramento with him on the Adams. Terry then leaves California to fight for the Confederacy in the Civil War. After the war is over, he flees to Mexico and tries his hand at farming. When that doesn't work, he returns to Stockton and resumes with the practice of the law. What about the California Supreme Court? Well, the California Supreme Court also leaves Sacramento. It moves to San Francisco in 1874. Now, here are some of the reasons expressed at the Constitutional Convention for ratifying the decision 2 years later. The fetid air rising from the miasmic swamps is such that hardly a vulture could fly over the city of Sacramento without dropping dead in his flight. One delegate says that he'd never been able to drink the water in Sacramento without chewing it. Quote, "The water is enough to drive men to intoxication, and they don't even get good whiskey. If we could get good whiskey, I would be willing to be more lenient to Sacramento and concede something to her. But they have the most villainous whiskey of any city I have ever had occasion to be in. I am disposed to stand up for San Francisco in this matter." And finally, the judges will be seen some of these days coming out of the courtroom in a boat. The hottest place outside of ... one down there. If you put it in the Constitution that the court shall sit in Sacramento in regular session all summer, they will have to be regular salamanders. Except for brief visits for ceremonial purposes, the California Supreme Court never returns to Sacramento again. We now move ahead in our story several years. The year is 1883, and the place is San Francisco. One of the city's richest and most prominent citizens, if not the richest and most prominent citizen, is Senator William Sharon. At that time, he is sued by a call girl named Sarah Althea Hill, who claims that 3 years earlier, he entered into a written, binding marriage contract with her. Sharon consults his good friend, Stephen J. Field, when he is served with this lawsuit. Of course, Justice Field, as a member of the Supreme Court, cannot represent Sharon, but he refers the senator to another lawyer who does represent him in the matter. Suits are then filed simultaneously in state court and federal court in San Francisco. The state court action proceeds to trial first. It is the O.J. Simpson case of its time. The entire world is interested in the case of the floozy who has sued the senator for half of his fortune. A little more than halfway through the trial in that case, Sarah Althea's lawyer is having difficulty handling her, so he associates another lawyer to assist him in the trial. That lawyer is from Stockton. Yes. Former Justice David Terry. To the courtroom observers, it soon becomes apparent that Terry and his client are developing more than a professional relationship. The trial centers on the question of whether the so-called marriage agreement is a forgery. After months and months of evidence, State Judge Jeremiah Sullivan shocks the world by deciding the case in favor of Sarah Althea Hill. She is elated, not to mention the richest woman in San Francisco. But the case then goes to trial in federal court, resulting in just the opposite decision, in a well-reasoned opinion by United States District Judge Matthew Deedy. Several things then happen. First, Terry marries his client. Second, Senator Sharon, heartbroken over the public humiliation and the threat of losing his fortune, deteriorates in his health and dies. Third, the United States Circuit Court, a higher federal court, is called upon to hear what is called a bill of reviver in order to determine whether Judge Deedy's decision would survive the death of William Sharon. If it does, of course, Sarah Althea will lose everything. And finally, the hearing on the bill of receiver will be presided over by none other than United States Supreme Court Justice Stephen J. Field. I now take you to the Federal Appraisers Building in San Francisco. The date is September 3rd, 1888. The building is filled with observers and the press. David and Sarah Terry are prominently seated in the courtroom. The judges take their seats promptly at 11 a.m. Justice Field, presiding, begins to deliver the opinion of the court. Within 5 or 10 minutes, the trend of the opinion becomes unmistakable. Sarah Althea begins to mutter. Terry urges her to remain silent. After about 20 minutes, the decision is obvious, and Sarah Althea screams, "Judge, are you going to take the responsibility of ordering me to deliver up that marriage contract?" Justice Field, in a calm voice, "Take your seat, madam." Sarah Althea, "How much did you get for that decision? You have been bought by the Newlands. How big was the sack?" Field, "Madam, be still and take your seat." Sarah Althea, "Justice Field, we hear you've been bought. No one can get justice in this court unless he has a sack. What have you been paid by the Sharon people? You have been bought by the Newlands coin. How much did the Newlands pay you?" Field, "Mr. Marshal, remove that woman from the courtroom. The court will deal with her later." Sarah Althea, "I won't go out and you can't put me out." She then continues, and the marshal steps toward her, and she says, "You dirty scrub, you dare not remove me from this courtroom." At that point, the chivalrous Terry stands. "No living man shall touch her. Don't touch my wife. Get a written order," he says. Terry then strikes the marshal with a hard blow to the mouth with his right fist. The blow breaks one of the marshal's teeth. The marshals then pin Terry to the chair. "God damn you, let me up, you sons of bitches, let me up," he says. The marshals then remove both of them from the courtroom. Out in the hall, Terry draws his trusted Bowie knife. "Look out," somebody says, "he's got a knife." The marshals then restrain Terry. He shouts, let go, you sons of bitches, I'll cut you to pieces. I will go with my wife." Later, in the room, the marshals found a loaded gun in Sarah Althea's purse. And in the meantime, inside the courtroom, Fields calmly finishes reading his opinion. Sarah Althea had lost her case. And for his conduct, Terry is found in contempt of court by his former colleague, Justice Field, and serves a term of 6 months in jail. We now move ahead. More to come. It's 1 year later. The date is August 14, 1889. Justice Field, again riding the circuit, boards a Southern Pacific train in Los Angeles, headed to San Francisco. He's accompanied by his bodyguard, Deputy United States Marshal David Nagel. Nagel's a short, stocky man, 35 years old. He had been a bartender, then a saloon keeper, and then he was elected town marshal in Tombstone, Arizona. He was a fast draw, left-handed gun, and he was present with Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday at the gunfight at the OK Corral. At 3 a.m., in the dark, the train makes a scheduled stop in Fresno. Nagel observes 2 figures enter the train. He recognizes them from the year before when he had been at the appraiser's building in San Francisco. He then goes to the sleeping Justice Field. "Mr. Justice Field," he says, "Judge Terry and his wife have just boarded the train." Field wakes up and groggily says, "I hope they have a good sleep." He goes back to sleep. Nagel then goes to the conductor and asks him to wire ahead to the sheriff of San Joaquin County for assistance. The train then pulls into its next scheduled stop at Lathrop. Nagel advises Justice Field to stay in the train and have breakfast brought in. Field refuses. He says it would show cowardice. "I have had good breakfasts in the dining room in Lathrop, and I prefer to eat there," he says. So Field and Nagel enter the dining room and sit down at a table. In a few moments, Terry enters. Terry walks up and down immediately behind Field, glaring at the back of his head. And then suddenly he turns and strikes Field, first in the face and then in the back of the head. Field is momentarily stunned. Then Terry reaches toward his vest. You know what Nagel thinks he's reaching for. Nagel then draws his pistol and at point-blank range shoots Terry, first in the chest and then in the head. Terry collapses to the ground. Nagel shouts to the horrified bystanders, "My name is David Nagel. I'm a United States Marshal, and I've shot him to protect the life of Judge Field." Judge Field shouts, "I am a Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States. My name is Judge Field. Judge Terry threatened my life and attacked me, and the Deputy Marshal has shot him." The crowd's still a little confused. Sarah Althea then comes running into the room. She sees Terry on the floor. She opens her satchel and draws out a large pistol. One of the bystanders disarms Sarah, and Nagel hustles Field back into the train. Well, just by chance, the sheriff of Stanislaus County happened to be on the train. He had boarded in Modesto. Although he didn't witness the shooting, upon the urgings of Sarah Althea, he arrests Nagel and locks him in the Stockton jail. The train then proceeds to Oakland, and Field proceeds to the federal courthouse in San Francisco. Sarah Althea then swears out a complaint for murder against Field. The sheriff of San Joaquin County proceeds to Field's chambers in San Francisco to execute the warrant. Field says, "Proceed with your duties, sir. I am ready. An officer should always do his duty." He adds, "I recognize your authority, sir, and submit to the arrest. I am, sir, in your custody." He adds, "You are but doing your duty, and your plain duty, and I am doing mine in submitting to arrest. The first duty of judges is to obey the law." With great ceremony, Fields then takes the arm of the sheriff and walks out with him. Of course, Field really has no fear at this point because arrangements have already been made for federal judge Lorenzo Sawyer to issue a writ of habeas corpus. returnable forthwith. So they moved down the hall to Judge Sawyer's office, where Field is promptly released. The California Attorney General later disavows Sarah's complaint and instructs the district attorney in San Joaquin County to dismiss the charges against Field. David Nagel was also ultimately freed in a still famous decision of the United States Supreme Court, sitting without Justice Field. The case is In re Nagel. It is still cited today for the proposition that a federal officer is immune from prosecution in state court for necessary and reasonable acts performed in the performance of his official duties. So that's the story. The story may sound like fiction, but I assure you it is taken directly from the history books. Much of it is in the Nagel decision of the Supreme Court. Every word of it is true. And it could have only happened here in California. You know what Terry's fate was. Well, in 1892, Sarah Althea Hill Sharon Terry was committed to the Stockton State Hospital for the Insane. She lived there for the last 45 years of her life until she died in 1937. Justice Stephen Field continued to sit on the United States Supreme Court until 1897, the second longest service of any justice of the Supreme Court in the history of the United States. He's regarded today as one of the most influential justices of his time. Many books have been written about his life. David Terry appears as no more than a footnote in the biography of Stephen Field. But now, as Paul Harvey would say, you know the rest of the story. Thank you.
Bill, that's just a great story, and a great contribution to our Heritage Lecture Series. It's, of course, shocking to hear that that was an era where there were charges of sexual impropriety and bribery at high levels. We're glad we live in a time when that sort of thing doesn't go on anymore. You've been to the club before, so that you know it's our custom to present our speakers with a token of our appreciation, a flag that flew over the capital of the state on its 150th anniversary at risk of life and limb to some of the members.
Thank you. Thank you, Phil. Being on the same program with people like Jim Holliday and Meade Kibbe made me a little apprehensive, but the thought that I might get this is what encouraged me to go on with it.
And we're glad you did. You're right up there with the rest of them.